the International Assembly of Women in Philosophy, which was a very interesting moment because I think there are few times in this world where we say to the organizer or to our colleagues, you mean the Suleiman Bashir Dian? I don't know how many people I thought had the same name. And it was very similar in 2006 when I shared a panel with Lewis Gordon to my left here, where I asked the organizer, you mean the Lewis Gordon? Because I think we still have a sense of disbelief that the people whose work we read and the people that we engage with can actually be among us. So it's very important for me to be here today and to share that with you. And also, just as a preliminary comment to the paper, a lot of what Bashir has done in terms of art, in terms of human rights, his writing, his critique of temples, his work on metaphysics of presence. I was the director for the Center for Critical Research on Race and Identity for 4 years, and after sabbatical I will now return to my original post. But Lewis Gordon, we've had the privilege of having Lewis come to the center and also see that we have boxes of the work of philosophers that are not taught by traditional philosophy departments in South Africa. Certainly Monsieur Pauline Hontunji, Bashir, Lewis, there's a whole group of men and women whose work we study as a prerequisite for furthering the aims of African philosophy, but also furthering the aims of African scholarship. A few comments as to the paper. I did my PhD at the University of Birmingham in the UK in the early 90s. I started just after Stuart Hall had left. So there's a tradition of writing very long papers. I'm very aware of the time constraints. I'm going to take a very short snippet. In addition, considering what my work is on, I work on Black consciousness, Black existentialism primarily, but also on Derrida and deconstruction and psychoanalysis. Now, the way that I do psychoanalysis is not, Freud is not my stepping stone. I see the interpretation of dreams, what happened in Egypt, the way in which we talk about an unconscious in all across the 54 countries in Africa, in different languages, in different styles, as crucial to that relationship between consciousness and politics, and more profoundly so in terms of the mind. And this is where, as a Black South African who was born in District 6, which is the old slave quarter of the Cape, of a Hindu grandmother who were enslaved by the Dutch. This is why my last name is Maart, the third month of the year. My grandmother was September and my cousins are April, who married a Xhosa man from the Eastern Cape. This is important because it situates us as Black people and as South Africans in the broader scheme of things, of tackling subjects that are forbidden in what white South Africans have determined is philosophy. So I think it's very important to be able to be here and to share this with you. It's going to be a smaller snippet of a 40-page paper, but I think I wanted to make some of those comments and also to say that not only is the work of Sheikh Anta Diop and Senghor appreciated and valued in addition to Bashir, but it is also the broader scheme of things of making sure that after 94, as we now enter the 24th year of democracy in South Africa, that we make sure that a new generation, which is why I was so happy to see school students and learners here this morning, that a new generation absolutely understands why it is important to develop a consciousness about a continent, not in the way that they've been taught under coloniality. So every concept has its own history. The history of the Black man subject in South Africa has several overlapping trajectories, a long and very complex history. usurped, brutalized, regionalized, coastalized, forced inland, ghettoized, tribalized, yet defiant, rebellious, determined, are all within the range of possibilities as points of departure for tracking this trajectory. It is therefore important that we analyze the trajectory within which the concept black man has been built, populated. To fight for the rights of the black man subject means to understand and to deconstruct the history of that subject. As such, the deconstruction of the subject is at the center of the fight for the rights of that subject. But which subject? The black man subject in the event of Marikana, which I'm sure you all know, 2012, August, many miners were killed, massacred, shows varied trajectories. It leads us to the black man subject as a miner and the black man subject as policeman. The deconstruction of philosophy does not always permit the deconstruction of the black man subject. Philosophy, in other words, European philosophy through its white mythology, has erased the black man subject, made him invisible, rendered him insignificant, reified him, written his presence as the absence of the words to say it, because he's written as death, dying, defeated. Malcolm X talks about this and reiterates that this Negro from the prefix necro, meaning death, corpse, a dead people. The deconstruction of the black man subject is necessary because we need to understand the history of the black man subject on whose behalf we claim these rights and in whose name we fight for freedom and whose name we uphold the South African Constitution. The subject's history is always at the center of his identity. Everything that occurs to the subject is an event. The subject is identical to itself, and yet, as I will demonstrate, the black man subject is split. The inverse Du Boisian split is at the center of the black man subject. When the black policeman sees his history of subjugation embedded in another black man, the protesting miner, he has to kill it, destroy it. If he sees it once, twice, 100 times, he has to kill it at once. To analyze the subject is to analyze all the hidden assumptions implied in the ethical, philosophical, political use of the term subject. So what is the hermeneutics of the subject? Hermeneutics, written, verbal, non-verbal, the protest march of miners finds its place within the scope of interpretation that is necessary in order to analyze the subjects that constitute the event. Why should philosophy then call upon the black man as subject? Is it because philosophy promises the subject his humanity, having previously declared him a slave? Philosophy of the present, philosophy as we currently know it, has outlawed slavery and asserted the need for rights for the black man subject to be human, even when being human is meant to be that he understood his oppression, that he understood himself as oppressed, and that consciousness of self meant consciousness of another, his master. Who calls out this end of philosophy and for which purpose? Marx, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche in the 19th century, Wittgenstein and Heidegger in the 20th century? Where are your philosophical protestations on the slave trade? Where are your philosophical articulations of Germany's Second Reich as they usurped Namibia in 1903? Killed, massacred, murdered, and brutalized the Nama and the Herero peoples until 1906 using barbed wire. The South African police learned well from your example to contain the remaining usurped masses who then starved to death. Those whose defeat Germany measured by African skulls in the sand, who did not hand over their land even when Germany planned its first Holocaust on southern African soil, and had the audacity to contest the word Holocaust, now having given it to the Jewish population half-heartedly, which it desecrated, handing over the word like a gift of life. Yet to Namibia you afford the word genocide, denouncing your own callous colonial efforts, erasing your own grotesque gestures, the sudden sleight of hand and mind, which allowed you to cross continents, having decided on the place for you to usurp, to kill, to murder, to maim, to brutalize, to massacre, to exterminate, in order to offer a people a home. Did you say the end of philosophy? As you sing, rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves, Britons never, never, never shall be slaves. You British colonizers, you take your brutality and turn it into a hymn, your patriotic salute to empire building where you usurp and enslave. Karl Jaspers writes, philosophy's a long hymn to reason. Did he have rule Britannia in mind, or was he instead considering the Christian justification of slavery, usurpation, massacres, and the premise upon which the Holocaust was built? James Thomson's poem, Rule Britannia, was set to music by Thomas Arne in 1740, the year Marquis de Sade was born, the year of the publication of David Hume's A Treatise of Human Nature, which he calls moral philosophy. Relying on slavery, he furnishes us with both the history of British colonialism and its history of repression, when in the treatise he restricts the role of reason to the production of action by asserting reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey him. Was Hume saying that reason is based on our emotions, or that reason steeped in the acquisition of slavery for the fulfillment of empire is the passion of the empire? Did you say the end of philosophy? It is only in the last century that questions of freedom, liberation, revolution, struggle, and decolonization, when oppressed people in the Third World, all of the wretched of the earth, revolted against slavery, usurpation, colonialism, and racism, that African American, Asian, Indian, indigenous, South and Central American philosophy scholars began to question the philosophy they were taught and examined the very clear absences of their own existential experience from inscriptions of philosophy. The reproduction of the dominant paradigm is evident when the scholar engraves that which denounces his being out of fear and lack, and steeped in the language of writing his absence, he asserts it, that a shift in thinking took place, a shift prompted by a shift in political action. This is the culmination of what has been produced as one of the strongest, most thought-provoking, most urgent strands of philosophy in the past 25 years, philosophy born of struggle. I just want to turn to the political action for a short time. Consciousness, knowledge, mind, thinking deemed necessary and important for students to study. It is always already present within each community based on the events that sustain it, the ideas that emerge from the events, and simultaneously situates its survival and its death. There's an event that requires our knowledge and our thinking in order to take action, and that event is the event of Marikana. Within the very event, the event of killing of black men, black miners who are killed and massacred by black men who are policemen. Perhaps Lacan's fundamentals of psychoanalysis, in which human beings dwell, cross over, merge, become one, are severed, cut, castrated, killed, murdered, massacred, converge, and lay themselves bare for scrutiny in order to build a theory of the subject. Psychoanalytic interpretations of the black subject in Southern Africa has also been tackled by scholars like, for example, Jean-Paul Rocky. Philosophy needs to know that in its attempt to depict the slave, and for years reading and rereading and reconstructing Hegel's master and slave dialectic. In South Africa, we have what is called the K-word, and it comes from the word kafir, which was used in Arabic to talk about infidel. It was also used by the British to talk about the annexation of the Cape, and the area was called Kafraria. So the depiction of the K-word that we have in South Africa, which is the word used very similarly to the N-word in the US. So what I'm arguing here is how in democracy what has happened to policemen, black policemen, learning from white policemen how to kill the native. Yes? How to kill that kafir. How to destroy it, because in other words, a modern South African democracy can only survive with the colonized black man who accepts that you have to kill yourself, you have to kill the native in order to be a proper black man. So that's the overall sense of my argument, and this is the overall sense of my understanding of what happened at Marikana. I'm not going to go through all of it. I'm going to just make a few remarks here. So the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real converge. They seek representation, a new explanation of the traumatic encounter with extreme violence, to which I give the name massacre. Massacre, whilst born of the colonial master at Marikana, it slumbered in the hands of the slave. The previously disenfranchised slave killing the previously disenfranchised slave brother who refuses modernity and postmodernity. For the colonized, colonialism and its trimmings, slavery, racism, is that traumatic encounter with the colonizer, which in turn has determined our concept of meaning, of understanding what it is to be human. What kind of events fits each of these dimensions? Doing philosophy from the foundations of Southern African events is doing philosophy within a context and through a medium, a context and medium from which our analysis of historical events are taken, a context and medium considered both valuable and traumatic, both gut-wrenching and grotesque, both critical and urgent, a context and medium under scrutiny cast at the backdrop of the Southern African world where it experiences its existentialism as both raced and colonial. Malcolm X was one of those revolutionaries, much like Stephen Bantu Biko, who did not hesitate to rely on philosophy, whether Greek or European, to turn it toward the plight of African American peoples. On the streets of Chicago, he spoke to crowds of people who gathered to hear him. He's particularly known for the manner in which he integrated the declaration, "The unexamined life is not worth living," to which Malcolm X added, when speaking of the plight of African Americans, the examined life is painful. The materiality of race does not allow us to overlook its construction, nor to ignore its ironies, however displeased we may be with the colonized. Philosophical thought, when inscribed, has to be a product of time, a product of an event. Apartheid in South Africa is a product of history, of the history of racism. Each is an event which exists within another event. Each event is part of the history of white supremacy. It is thus when understanding the relationship between the transcendental and the ontological, when philosophy defines its meaning, situates its purpose. Being mindful of usurpation, colonialism, racism, massacres, the transcendental and the ontological, one may approach the event. The event begins with the disclosure of being, with the horizon of genealogies of meaning as the basis for the discussion of the event. Is the event an alteration of the way reality appears to us, or shattering transformation of reality itself? Does philosophy reduce the autonomy of an event, or can it account for this very autonomy? So I'm going to stop here. I'm happy to pass on the paper to anybody else. It is 40 pages, and we also have a research group at the university that looks at philosophy born of struggle, philosophy born of massacres. I'm happy to talk to you during the break and afterwards. Thank you very much.